Hi, welcome and namaste to the Yoga Out of the Box podcast. My name is Marvin, and on this podcast, we try to free yoga from all its cliches and boxes and to showcase that yoga has like more than just one approach, that there are so many different teachers, styles, journeys out there you can explore, and you can like take the best out of all of this experience into your private life. That's why we bring you each week a new super interesting conversation with a podcast and with a interesting yoga practitioner, teacher, sometimes breathwork instructors, sometimes IFBAF experts, sometimes like experts from different fields, which are all combined in this big field of yoga. So I hope you enjoy this podcast this week. You see, maybe you hear I'm in Brazil, and I had the chance to speak to Tiago Prem, and he is like doing for now almost 25 years like Ashtanga, and like he has a really, really open approach to Ashtanga. We talked about his teachers, his journey in yoga, as well as like his open approach to like help people to adjust, and what he thinks is like a good way for a yoga teacher to get into a practice. So I hope there's some value in this episode for you. Like always, make sure to follow the podcast on Spotify. Make sure to leave a good review on the podcast player if you trust. This really helps us out and helps us to provide you each week a new super interesting conversation with like a super interesting guest. And let's dive right into this episode. Hi and welcome, Tiago Prem. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fine, man. So we already had like a short pre-talk. Maybe for the audience who not already know you, could you shortly introduce yourself and give us a kind of backstory, where you are,
Yeah.
what you're doing?
Yeah, for sure. So my name's Tiago Prem, or Prem, you pronounce it. It's an Indian name. Probably where you are down south, like people want to say Tiago, but it's a Sanskrit name. Tiaga is primary teaching in the Bhagavad Gita, which is like the renunciation of the fruits of action. That's like Tiaga would be like a kind of like a yogi, but it would be more like a householder yogi, like a minimalist, only keep what's necessary. And then prem means love. So it's kind of like only keep that which is love, and everything else you can let it go. So the name is a reminder, uh, to stay connected to like why, I guess, like even with practice, why am I doing this in the first place? It's not so much to get something, but to connect deeper to the heart, and the heart that's in all living beings, or something like that. So it's a nice name.
That's for sure. Thanks for
And
this
then as
input.
far yeah. And then as far as my backstory with yoga, I mean, I've been practicing yoga for 25 years of my life. I started mostly with like my first yoga teacher was like a practice of, there's no asanas. It's like more kind of like what you read about in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, like sitting practice, essentially, but applying the philosophy of Patanjali. And then when I was in college studying religion with a focus on Eastern philosophy, I started doing asanas with a teacher there. And I began my journey with Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga. And through the years, I mean, I'll cover 25 years in like 3 minutes. Let's go over 3 minutes. So just to put this into perspective, I started with Ashtanga Vinyasa. I also learned a little bit of Jiva Mukti Yoga in the early days, which is like an offshoot of Ashtanga with David and Sharon. And my Ashtanga teacher, she's been practicing for over 40 years. She's like an OG from the Shal. She lived at the Joyce home in the early days. And I was pretty keen as a student in those days. I'm still keen, but that was over 20 years ago. And she was always like, you need to find somebody who can kind of meet you where you're at. And I don't know that you're going to get it just from doing these series over and over. I mean, she's an amazing teacher, continues to be a teacher. She's climbed Everest twice. She's like a force of nature.
Wow, that sounds like that.
Yeah. She had recommended that I go to New York and practice with this character, Sri Dharma Mitra. And now, because of the internet and everything, people really know who that is. But back then, like I had seen his book, like 608 Yoga Postures, and seen the picture, the 908 asanas on the wall, but I didn't know anything beyond that. Like, is is this person still alive? Are they from India? Like, what's the story? It's not like now where you can just go on Instagram and see, he's 85 now and still practicing. So
And doing crazy stuff, yeah.
amazing. Yeah, I love him. And so I went to New York and spent as much time as I could with Dharma and kept doing Ashtanga and studying both methods. And then I spent some time studying Iyengar yoga and then later some Kundalini yoga. For me, in my 25-year journey, it's never been about like what flavor, or what school. I've always looked at it as one practice. And I've
Mm-hmm.
always looked at the postures as hatha yoga, no matter what, like if you call it vinyasa or if it came from T. Krishnamacharya lineage or if it came from Rishikesh, or I never really bought into that. I was more interested in like the innovators and the people who were like actively exploring the practice as a living tradition. And I found the most helpful way to approach that for me personally, and everybody's different, right? I should say that too. But for me, like the most effective way to do that was to like learn the traditions and learn the recipes and learn the maps and study the old ways and the scriptures, etc. And then also like spend time with innovators and people who are thinking outside of the box, like Dharma is a big one like that. And then like have teachers who would also give me the green light to do the same, to explore and not be like, no, it's only this
It
and
has to
you
be
must
this.
only. Yeah. And I've been really blessed. Like anytime I was in an environment, especially in Ashtanga, like people are like, oh God, some people are so like anal and strict. But I never, like anytime I came across that, I would just move on, because like the people who really inspired me, like my teacher Tina, she's been doing this for 40 years. Like she always gave the green light to explore. Dharma, he always gave the green light to explore. And then later I spent another great teacher he's 79 and he's been practicing for a long time. He lives between Seattle and LA. His great aunt brought Yogananda from the Autobiography of a Yogi book. She brought him on the ship from India to the Boston Harbor in 1919. He shared a photograph with
Wow.
me. So he was around Yogananda as a boy. And so he's also been like a father figure to me. And I pick his brain. His name's Guru Singh. He was also a musician in the 60s. So he played music with the Grateful Dead. He knew Janis Joplin. He's quite a character. But even with him, like when I was learning techniques more from like the Kundalini side of things, also, I don't see it as different. Like they all share the same root. I was also given the green lights. I mean, I think what I try to do in the way that I share yoga and practice yoga is to remind people that like this is your practice and you're a student of a practice that has roots and tradition, and you want to understand the roots, but you also want to know the rules so that you can break them and find new avenues and pathways. And I think a lot of people think it's got to be one way or the other. Like you follow the tradition, you have the one teacher, you do the method, or you just like take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and they kind of ignore the rest and be free. In my experience, it's like we need both. And maybe not every person is going to practice in both. Maybe they don't have the time or they don't feel the calling to do that. But that's been my experience. And then as far as like where I'm at now, I teach in a Mysore setting because I
Mm-hmm.
like teaching individually to each student depending on their conditions. And I think that's a genius part of Ashtanga yoga. I think that the way
Absolutely.
like present day yoga practices where everyone comes in and the teacher plays music and talks and walks around the room, that's all good if you know like what you're doing, but chances are you're not really going to learn anything there. It's more like a party. Like you go and you're
Yeah.
having an experience and you're having fun and if you know what you're doing, you're gold. It's fun.
That's
I go sometimes, but you're not going
yeah.
there to learn. It's not really a school. It's like a experience. So I
That's so
love the Mysore
interesting.
setting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that means I don't always teach the recipe. It's like
Mm-hmm.
if I have a student who's like waiting for a hip replacement or a student who is like, whatever it is, they're really tight and like getting them to do even primary series is like probably not going to happen in this life. Like I don't follow that recipe. But then there's
Mm-hmm.
other students who like their intent is like they want to learn Ashtanga yoga the way it's taught today. First, second, third, fourth series. Okay, we can do that. Like, and having all these recipes is really helpful because then you can meet the person where they're at. And the Mysore room is a great way to do it because you get to know them, you get to know them by name, you get to know why they're there, which I'm so thankful to the Ashtanga Yoga Vinyasa tradition for that.
Mm-hmm.
But following the recipe, it's just not going to fit everyone. So I try and practice and teach according to my conditions and also according to the conditions of the student, which is where Ashtanga Vinyasa came from with Krishnamacharya. Teach each person individually where they are. So that's I know it was longer than 3 minutes, but that's
Man,
my
that was
background in a
perfect.
nutshell.
Thank you so much for sharing. This is like super interesting, and I'm really keen on like going into several topics of that. I hope I can remember all of them.
Yeah, there was a lot
I
in
love
there.
that. Yeah, I love this part because it gives the most people like a kind of impression. Even nowadays, everything is like most of the time in terms of social media, like super superficial. And so we don't
Mm-hmm.
get to know a person like really deeply and get into all of these small tweaks. So
Mm-hmm.
let's maybe start out with in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a step back. When you started
Sure.
your yoga journey, you remember what first got you hooked into yoga? So you said you practiced it already really early, even without like the asana part, which is like, I think nowadays, a lot of people come just from the asana part. Realize that by myself, when I started practicing yoga, that I have not so much connection to the spiritual part or like the mindfulness part of all. Sometimes nowadays it's even like a kind of sport, or people interpret it like as a kind of stretching, So it's like interesting to see the other side from the metal. Just a short reminder for you. If you haven't yet, please make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify. Please leave a good review on the podcast player of your trust. This really helps us out to reach more people and to bring new interesting people on the podcast. So if there was any value in this episode so far for you, please don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much. Back to the episode.
Yeah. So when I was a kid growing up, like I was into a lot of trouble and left home as a teenager and kind of came up around like graffiti culture and punk rock music and also hip hop music. And I think my parents had me pretty young. And so they didn't know what to do with this rebellious youth in the home. And so we had a lot of clashes. And so I left early and, my brain wasn't fully developed and I was just being like basically raised by my peers and in the streets and being wild and crazy, and I learned a lot and it was fun. And I mean, I have a 12-year-old now and I hope she doesn't go that route because I wouldn't recommend it, but I did learn a lot. And when I decided like I was going to finish high school, and so I went back home to live with my family, and it was really difficult, and I, had problems with addiction, etc. And my mom had a friend who she went to India because she was like a I don't know, oil exec or something. She worked in an oil company and like made a lot of money. Single woman, no family, not married. Eyes on the prize, like corporate mindset, like work your way to the top, make your money, etc. And she basically like worked herself into a nervous breakdown, and she was not well and she didn't know what to do, and like taking a bunch of medication wasn't going to be the answer. And so she went to India on a spiritual quest essentially. And when she was there, she uncovered this practice there's a group in India called the Brahma Kumaris, which is like there's a university. I haven't been, and I don't know a lot about the background. This is just where I started. And it changed her life. And she came back and she continued to do the work that she was doing. She had all this disposable income. So she started a yoga center, but they didn't teach asanas there. They taught yoga philosophy, they taught meditation. And so my mom thought, maybe
That's my biggest
there'd be
starting point.
maybe there'd be a connection there, right? And so I started going there, and I really liked her. She was cool. She was like I was used to being around adults who were like judgmental or talk down to you, or just didn't haven't much interesting to say. And then there was this lady who's like left the corporate world to go to India and knew a lot about different spiritual traditions and was really open-minded. And so, my mom tried to get me to go to therapy and to rehab and all these other avenues, and which are great avenues. I mean, I explored those also later, but for whatever reason, I felt to connect with this person. And you could say it's like a God moment. Like it was for sure a connection where we were meant to meet each other, I think, looking back. But that's where I started. And so I just started asking questions. And if she didn't know the answer, she'd like direct me to someone else or recommend a book. Or so that's how I started then. And then when I did finish school and did go to college, that's why I decided to study Eastern philosophy, because there was a lot in there that I really liked. Like, being raised in a environment where it was like there's like a God in the sky judging you, and when you die, you'll either go to the good place or the bad place. That was pretty simplistic. And to get ideas about reincarnation, and it's all happening right here, and you can do the work now, like those are simple views, but to the mind of a teenager, I was like, this makes more sense to me. And so I started exploring that, and then took the route of like academics, because that's just what you did. Like I didn't have like a teacher at the time who'd been doing this for 40 years or whatever that I could ask all these questions to. I had this woman who was relatively new and open to exploring with me. So I thought, how can I learn these things? Well, I took a conventional education route and went to university and learned about the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedas and all those things. And then I started doing some asanas while I was in college. And the dean of the program, or like the head of the religious studies program, he practiced. And so I started asking him a lot of questions about yoga. And at some point he said, you're a yogi. You stop wasting all your money here, go out and like do the practice. And then when you're old, like me, if you decide you want to be a professor or something, go back to school. And don't tell the university that I gave you this advice, basically. And so I took his advice, and I didn't finish my time there. And I just went out and practiced. And that experiment is still going.
Man, amazing. Yeah, sometimes it sounds like, some things come on your way like in the right moment and right time where it should happen. And even when we go a bit further in like your journey, it sounds like you had like a few moments where you had the opportunity to have like, you found great teachers, you found like great places to learn and like to take the next step. So it would be interesting for me to see, okay, how did you find them, or how do you define nowadays? How would you recommend to find a teacher, maybe even? Because I think it's, nowadays everybody is like expert, and everybody tries to like be an expert online. So it's like a big difference between that.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a couple of things I would recommend. The first thing is like my first Ashtanga teacher, she would always say to me, just do the practice and don't worry about anything else. Because I would always be like, do I need to be vegetarian or vegan or practice 5 days a week? Or like, people are like that when they're like young in the practice. You had all these questions, and like you want somebody to tell you how to do it, right? And she would always say like, just do the practice. Don't worry about anything else. Just show up and do it. And I remember thinking in those days, like, it can't be that simple. Like, you have to have a plan and like that mindset. And now I find myself all these years later telling people the exact same thing. Like, just do it. Like, just do the thing. And whatever the questions you have, like, you'll find those answers within you by doing the practice. And whatever's meant to be will be. And it sounds kind of airy fairy or whatever you want to call it, but it's just the way it works. Like if you show up for it, the where you're meant to be will present itself. So that's one thing. But then the other thing is like, there's this whole culture around like teacher training and getting the piece of paper and all of that. And that's fine, if that's where you feel called. What I tell people and what I did is like, if you find somebody that like really inspires you and like you can see and feel like in their presence there's something there, just be around them. Like that's how you learn to be a teacher. It's like, you know, when I met my teacher, Tina, who climbed Everest twice, she had had a spinal cord injury when she was young. And so she couldn't do any asanas. She was laying in a bed, and she eventually, because of the depression and rage of like, I might not be able to walk again, eventually she started setting her alarm in her hospital bed and going through the Ashtanga sequence mentally and just doing the breathing. And that was that started to improve her physical and mental condition. And so when I met somebody like that, I just like, I moved where she lived, and I just spent as much time with her as I could. That was my teacher training. And then when she told me go to Dharma, so I went to Dharma, I met him, spending time around him, and I was like, yep, this is my guy now. And so, you know, he had all the things, 200 hour, 500 hour, 800 hour, 1000 hour trainings, like, you know, how they're done today in the Yoga Alliance and all that. So I was like, okay, whatever it takes to spend time around him, that's what I'll do. So I live in on the west coast of Canada, and he lives in New York City. So that means like saving money, going to New York, spending time with Dharma, doing all of the things. And I'll tell you right now, where I learned the most from Dharma is not in the teacher trainings. Those were all wonderful. But where I learned the most, and he told me this too, he said, true psychic knowledge is true spiritual knowledge is transmitted psychically. And what that means is like, you just be in the presence of somebody who's like a master, for lack of a better word, like somebody who's like really the living embodiment of the practice. You just spend time with them. And some of the most profound moments I've spent with him are like driving him somewhere in a car, talking about life. Like those are big. You can't pay for that. You know, I'd like to pay to drive this person to and from here. You can't sign up and pay for that. You get that from hanging around, you know? And then the other thing that's really helped me a lot in my practice of teaching is assisting him in the room and just watching, like, how is he helping people? What does he do when he walks into the room before the students get there? You know, all of these things. And then like humbling myself, where I would like correct the student and I put them into a posture, and then he would come and take them out of the posture and put them in a different way, and then be like, kind of like, see, that's how you do it, and be like, oh my God, like feel so embarrassed. But you learn so much from that. And it's like, it doesn't come from
putting out your ego.
Yeah, it just comes from spending time. And so it's like, some of the problem today with like Instagram, like I love Instagram. You had Alex Hammer on your podcast. I do some online stuff with him and keep in touch with him. And, you know, he's got really cool ideas. And if it wasn't for Instagram, and I'm always a student, you know, even though I've been doing yoga longer than him, I love learning new things and new approaches and new ideas. So that's a positive thing about Instagram. I can get some input or listen to a podcast like this, you know, learn, meet new friends and all that. Yeah. And then if you find somebody that really resonates with you, like the way you find a teacher is like, you just go and be around them and figure it out. Like people go to Mysore in India, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be New York. It can be an hour away from where you live instead of the local studio, because this hour away person really inspires you. Like the signs are there. And when they're there, I would advise you to like get out of your head and like, you must do it this way. You just feel it and go like, there's something there. I really feel connected to this person, so I'm going to figure it out. And that's how you find a teacher. How's that?
Man, that's so valuable. Yeah, but I love the point. I had once, so to the first part what you said, I always remind the story, you know, this for sure, like when Patabi Joyce first came to the US, he was saying like practice is like 95% and 5% is theory. And then the people in the West started asking so many questions that he said, like, after the second trip, practice is 99% and theory is just 1%. And I think this describes really good, like, how we act often like in nowadays societies. We try to understand everything on a like superficial level and try to make sense out of stuff. And to do actually the work is something which is like, I think this is something most people can go back to in the beginning. So thanks for sharing that. And the second part, like, I can totally sign that. Spending time with somebody who's like really like inspiring you and like giving you, you know, where you already feel, okay, wow, I can learn something here. That's like in both ways. It can be humbling, but it can be like, you know, it definitely brings you further on your own journey.
Yeah. And like when it comes to practicing, like you were saying, with the 99% practice and 1% theory, the important thing I think in that lesson is that, and Ashtangis, they love to use that saying as a means to say like you've just got to do like asana all the time. And I think in some ways they're missing the point. The 99% practice, 1% theory, for me, what it really means is like, it means to be practicing all the time. And to be practicing all the time is not talking about asanas.
Not
It's
just
talking
the hour
about
on the
like,
mat.
yeah, it's talking about like, are you really paying attention to what's happening around you? Are you really tuned in and like designing your life around your sadhana or spiritual practice so that you're really listening? You're really listening to your body. You're really listening to God or your inner guide. You're really listening to the nature around you. Like you're really present for what's happening. Like to me, that's what that means. It's not about like, you know, get in the next posture or get into the next series and that's all fine. Like believe me, I love a challenge, like new depths and new, like that's part of the journey is like you challenge yourself and you face your fears. But I think what can happen also with that is like people lose sight of the listening part. And like, you know, it's like your body's trying to talk to you and you're like trying to follow the sequence. Well, that's a problem because the sequence is there to help you listen to your body, not the other way around. Not to ignore your body and follow the sequence. That's backwards.
I think this is like a good point because I think this brings us even like to the kind of practice you're teaching now. Because I find this like really interesting to see like different styles and to go to like even points like Ashtanga a bit more open-minded. Because like you said, most of the time people have this understanding of Ashtanga or this fixed picture in their head, right? And to open that up and like including into a practice like everything and even saying it's hatha in the beginning because everything we're doing nowadays is like it's rooted in the hatha tradition, right? So I would love to hear more about like how you try to include that or how do you like distill this, because I think a lot of people like not in the beginning can or try to think so much outside the box. Did you had like any experience that you were like feeling for yourself, okay, maybe I have to change something in this kind of practice, or was it right from your teachers?
Yeah. In the beginning, I definitely like followed the recipe. It's like learning to cook. When you're learning to cook, you follow the recipe because you don't know what you're doing, right? It's like, you know, you might know how to boil water or something like, but other than that, you're like kind of in the dark. And so you need to follow the recipe. And I'm really grateful for the recipes. You know, I think that the recipes in Ashtanga Vinyasa at yoga are great recipes. It always makes me laugh when people are like, well, you must not change the recipe. It's like, well, you don't really know your roots if you think don't change the recipe because it's been changed a lot through the years. And also the Ashtanga Vinyasa tradition, the way that the Joyce family taught it, that's a relatively new concept. This is not like some ancient thing, and nor does it have to be ancient. I think it's amazing that it's new and it's innovative. And it's a great recipe and it's really helpful. Like when somebody comes into the room and they're young and they're able bodied and they want to learn to do asanas and they step into the Mysore space and it can be intimidating because there's like people doing wild things all around them. There's no anonymity. They can't hide. The teacher is like on their mat from the get-go. It's like really helpful to be able to be like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to start with Surya Namaskar A, the same way you would teach somebody how to move around the kitchen. But then like over time, especially as a teacher, like you're going to realize like that's not going to fit every person who comes into the room. Like if the person can't touch the floor and they're like folding forward, or they're like telling you they've been doing it for a year and like their body's in pain, and like they're afraid to try something else, or they're like knee hurts because they keep trying to do Marichasana D or even B, and they're like, I don't want to like stop because I might lose progress. Like there's all these stories and like guilt that comes along with it. It's like that's a problem, because you're not really like teaching the person how to cook, which is the goal. You're teaching the person how to follow the recipe. And sometimes the teacher doesn't really know outside of the recipe because that's what they learned. Like they learned, they followed the recipe, they went to the great cooking school in Mysore, and they learned how to follow the recipe really well. And that's amazing. Like, don't get me wrong, the recipe is helpful. But like, what makes you a teacher? I really like Danny Paradise. He's an incredible early day practitioner, and like people call him like the jungle physician because he's just wild. My friend told me like with Danny Paradise, he said like it doesn't matter if he's in a 5-star restaurant in New York City or in the middle of the jungle, he's wearing pink pants and no shirt. So that kind of puts it into
That's
perspective.
A good description, actually.
Yeah, how he is. And he said, what makes you a teacher is that somebody asks you to show them what you do. That's what makes you a teacher. And I think that's a really profound statement, even though it sounds simple, because it's like, I have a responsibility as a longtime practitioner of this. Like when somebody shows up in front of me and they want to learn, it's my responsibility to uncover like what is it they want to learn and what are the conditions that they're dealing with in their life, and how can I support them by making in collaboration, because their practice, there's nothing special about me except for that I've had nothing better to do with my life than try and put my leg behind my head. And also like I've had some healing experiences from addiction, and it's helped me be a better father and partner and general human being. And I still have tons of problems and that kind of thing. But you have a responsibility to meet that person where they're at. And the tradition of Ashtanga Vinyasa, as passed down from T. Krishnamacharya, like that's how it's been. It's meant to be like that. And what happened for Western students is like they weren't given the green light to teach in that way. And who knows why? Maybe it was because of business and you wanted to keep the people coming back and you thought you'd lose clients. Or maybe there just like wasn't the capacity to do that because of the language difference. Or maybe as it grew, there wasn't room to teach people how to teach. It was just to teach people how to practice. I have no idea. But I do know that if we want to be traditional in our approach to this thing, that the genius of this practice as taught by T. Krishnamacharya and also by my teacher Dharma and other innovators is that the practice is meant to be tailored to the individual student. And in order to do that, you're going to need a whole toolbox full of recipes and tools, etc., that are going to help the person. And the last thing I'll say about this is that the students that are going to ask you to teach them, they're going to show up like there's like a natural order to it, I think. Like someone may show up and they want to learn it exactly as is, and it's going to piss them off that you are not only offering the one recipe, and they're going to have to drop away because it's not a good fit, and that's fine. And then other students are going to show up. Maybe they've been doing it for a long time in that way, and then something happens. It's like they hurt their hip or they hurt their back and they can't practice in that way, and they've got to release the recipe. And then maybe the two of you, the student and the teacher, are like, I don't really know what to do with this, but I'm willing to like try and figure it out with you together, and we'll explore together. And I'll bring what I know and you bring what you know, and we'll like come together. Like, to me, that's what the Mysore room is meant to be. And so there's room for the recipe following, there's room for honoring the tradition, and also honoring the tradition means teach the student where they're at based on their conditions. And, I had a student recently with a prosthetic limb come. She was visiting in town at the Shala. And so she had a prosthetic leg. And she's done Ashtanga yoga. She knows the practice, but I just met her. And so I had a responsibility as a teacher to hang back, watch what she does, and let her know, I'm going to watch what you do. I'm not going to get involved in your practice. Yep. And then as I observe and see, then I can start asking questions. How does it feel if I give you this adjustment? What does your teacher in Australia, she's from Australia, do here? If there's anything that you can show me. So we're like learning together. It's like a learning space. And by the end of her time in her visit, say she's around for like 6 weeks or something, by the end, we're like in a flow together. And I know
Hmm.
like how to help her, and she knows, like how I can show up. And then that's the genius of the Mysore room. If she had just showed up at a conventional yoga class, I would have just ignored her because I didn't know what to do, and she maybe would have felt ignored and she would have moved on. But the fact that we were in an environment where we get to learn together the practice, I mean, that's really powerful. And so, you know, I I just would advise, and the way that I approach it is everything that I've learned, nothing is off the table. Let's explore, let's see what we can do. And I know I don't know everything. There's more to be learned. I can learn from the students, they can learn from me, and we can also honor the tradition of like, thank goodness for the Mysore space, because without it, we might have missed those opportunities.
I really love that point, even that you mentioned earlier, that, like a lot of conventional yoga classes, and I see this a lot, if you go to the West, to Europe, for example, so I have like a lot of friends teaching all over Europe, all over the US, and that we really often have this kind of event character in studios. It's like you said before, it's more this one time fix. And a lot of people nowadays even know yoga as, oh, I go there once a week, twice a week to feel better on my mat after the practice. But this point of like, you really want to teach them. And this is like the so essential part of if you're really a yoga teacher, or if you're just like, kind of an, I don't know, like you have an event character in that, right? And having this
Mhm.
idea of like taking out these different parts of how maybe even in the beginning or in the early days, even in the Joyce family called the center like the research institute, right? So it was always more about this exploration and seeing and growing together. So I really like this part. When we come to the point of teaching and even more like your own practice, I always like to see the perspective of like people already practicing and teaching for a long time. How has this changed over time? And what do you think you learned from like teaching? And what do you think is nowadays your own practice looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I can share like when I had a pretty serious injury doing yoga asanas. I don't know how long ago, uh, 10 years or something, maybe a little bit longer. I was I was a basketball player growing up, so I have some knee issues, and I have one leg that if I hold my back foot, like in Ekapada Raja Kapotasana, like a pigeon, where you hold the back foot, if I hold the back foot and my back leg is on the ground, I have to really squeeze my quadricep muscle. If I don't, when I let go of the foot, the knee cap is loose in the socket and can come out of place. And one time I was in New York with Dharma, and there's like 100 people in the room. It might have even been his birthday. It's like a big party, like people from all over the world who can do all these
Yeah.
amazing shapes. And I'm right near the front. And I go back and I grab my back foot in the full split, long split. I touch the foot to the head, and then I just let it go. Like, like didn't think to use the tools that I'm talking about that I know I need to use. And my knee came out of the socket in the full splits. And I saw like I saw my life flash before my eyes, as they say. Like in that, it was only like a second or two, right? In that second or two, when the knee was out of the joint socket, I could see myself like being put into a stretcher, carried out of the yoga shala on the 6th floor in Manhattan, and just being this whole spectacle and never doing yoga again, or whatever. And my mind said to me, or my inner God was like, bend your knee as hard as you can. So I bend my knee, it came back into place, and I kind of fell over, removed myself. Nobody even really knew what happened, even though
Yeah.
time stood still for that moment. Then sometime after that, I just really pulled away from the asanas and just took some reflection on like, why am I doing this in the first place?
Mhm.
And it was around that time that I was like smoking a lot of weed back then and still drinking and all these things. And so I got sober during that time and pulled away from doing the asanas. And with the journey of sobriety, it's like it's not an instant thing. Like you've got things to work through as you go, and habits and patterns that you have that are not helpful. And so I started exploring some other aspects of the practice and didn't put so much emphasis on the asanas. And then, we had 2 yoga centers called Dharma Temple, and at the start of the pandemic, we closed them because we didn't know like what was going to happen. The government was saying here, "Oh, it'll be 3 weeks or a month," and I was like, "Yeah, right. Doesn't feel like that at all." That old punk rock mentality of mine to question authority rose right up to the surface, which was a good thing. And we closed those centers down and we went traveling, and we went to Costa Rica, and we went to Panama, and we went to Mexico. And
That's so funny because
my
I did the same. I
oh, well,
was
there you go.
actually
We're on the
in
same.
COVID, like, cool.
Yeah. So we did that. And my intention was, while I was away, was to like get back into doing asanas again and eat fruit and fast and, do the yogi things. And it did not happen the way I expected. When I was away, I got really sick and lost a lot of weight, and it scared me. Actually, I've never felt like I could die kind of a feeling. And people say, well, what were you sick with? I can't answer that. We were in a remote place in the jungle. There wasn't like I could go to a conventional doctor. And honestly, I think it was more of just like a purging of all this stuff that I was hanging on to after going through the injury and all of the like getting sober and then like losing our business and community. Like there's a lot. And I had 4 friends pass away during that first year before we went.
Oh,
Like I
wow.
was holding a lot, and I wasn't sure what to do with it, basically. And so we went away, and I got better, and I slowly started getting back into the practice. And then when we moved back to Canada, after my daughter went to 4th grade in Mexico, and that was awesome. And I had friends in Mexico who were like, you need to get back to teaching. Like you have all this knowledge. And I was sort of hesitant to do that. I was like, I'm just going to practice. I don't want to teach too much. It was just taking my time getting back into it. And then when I got back to Vancouver, my friend has a Mysore program, and I was like, I'll go back once or twice a week, back to my roots. And so I was going once a week, twice a week, then 3 times a week, then 4 times a week, then 6. Like I was just like,
Yeah.
okay, I guess I'm back at the beginning. I'm back at the beginning here. It was really trippy. And then it was like, you should teach. And then next it was like having my own program. And next it was, so it was definitely another God moment and brought me back into Ashtanga. And so that's kind of where I started doing the sequences again. And it felt really great. And then when I started the Mysore program and students started coming, that's where I was like, oh yeah, there's got to be more than just repeating these sequences, because it depends on the person. And so I started to explore as a student other things, like what did I do with Dharma and how did that help me, and how would I share this, and then noticing like, coming to Kapotasana in second series, because I've done it for a while. What could I do to open the shoulders, and how did I do that with Dharma, and who else could I ask questions? And that's where I connected with Alex Hammer, who you'd had
Yeah.
on the show, because he's got some really good ideas. And then like all of a sudden I'm like back in the kitchen and I'm doing all the things. Like I've got the Ashtanga on the pot over here, I've got the Dharma on the pot over here, I've got the other ideas over here, still studying yoga philosophy, and then I'm like back in the flow. And so the question you asked me, like with my personal practice, like what do I do, that's kind of how I approach it. I started doing first, and then second, and then third, and then some of fourth, and it came back pretty quick. But then, like as I was doing it, it was more like, I've got this hip thing coming up. Okay, let's look at that. Shoulders are blocked here. Let's look at that. And then over the past couple of years, it's been really about like noticing, like how do I, like, my goal with being a student of Dharma is like when I'm 85, or my other teacher Guru Singh, who's 80, when
Yeah.
I'm that age, like I want to be able to move like they do. like Dharma's still doing
I think that would
handstands and
be amazing.
yeah. And so then if that's my goal, it's not to finish first, second, third, fourth series as prescribed. It's to like
Mhm.
keep my body in the state that I'm able to do that. And so what that looks like is I mostly do like on one day I'll do like extensions or back bends and splits. The next day I'll do forward bending and leg behind the head stuff. The next day I'll focus on strength and arm balancing. And I more like focus on areas of the body. And sometimes that'll mean like doing second series or doing third series. And other times it'll be like applying some stuff I learned from Dharma, or it'll be like I learned some tricks from Alex that I'm going to try on that day. But it will always be like specific to a certain area of the body. And that's really working. And it also keeps me like in this innovative space where it's like, oh yeah, that person, they're really struggling with doing Triang Mukha, or like putting up one leg in Virasana, or they're really struggling with the Crunchasana, or they're really struggling with the Kapotasana, or they're really, whatever it is, like I can apply what I'm doing in my own practice to the conventional method of the Ashtanga Vinyasa. And then other people will just be like, my hips are so tight, I can't even sit on the floor. Then we don't even look at the Ashtanga sequence. Like, okay, here, let's
That's that
give you
earlier.
a couple exercises you can do. And then maybe over time they'll be like, I want to learn the Ashtanga thing. Or maybe they're like, no, I'm good like doing this, or whatever. Yeah. So it's definitely a space of exploration and research on my mat. I get up every morning at 2:40 in the morning and I practice from 3:15 till 5:15.
Wow.
Students come at 5:15 and practice till 9 a.m. And then I do an afternoon practice where I more do like headstand, shoulder stand, and seated postures like holding long Padmasana, holding long like seated forward folds, sitting in Virasana. If I'm up for it, putting the leg behind the head, but more static. And that would be like more of an Iyengar approach where the
Mhm.
afternoon is inversions and like more stationary meditative inversions and keeping the body open. That's what I do. And every week's a little bit different. And I have my recipes that really work well for me, like Ashtanga, like what I learned from Dharma, like what I've learned from Iyengar yoga and Vijnana yoga, which is from Donna Holoman, who was with Iyengar in the 60s. So what she learned from him when he was still teaching vinyasa, that practice is really dear to my heart. And then like doing pranayama, like I basically, like what Dharma would say, is like I'm a professional. I've got nothing better to do than study yoga all day. And so I do as much of it as I can and share as much of it as I can and try and do it in a way that is scalable, meaning
Mhm.
like it has stages for every person, including me, and in a way that's enjoyable. Like if it's not fun, you're probably doing it wrong. If the Mysore room, I really love Manju Joyce, and he said, if the Mysore room feels like a funeral, like you're in the wrong spot, you need to find a new shala. And that really resonates with me.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I just, I explore, make it scalable, make it enjoyable, all for the purpose of I want to be doing this when I'm 90 years old and following the footsteps of my teachers who are really incredible, inspiring people and not afraid to explore and trust their inner guide and at the same time honor tradition along the way.
It sounds like you know all, like you know your kitchen stuff and how to use it, and now it's more about like seeing what's on the table each day and figuring out which menu is like suiting who. I really like
Yeah,
this.
I definitely have to have a little bit of structure because without it,
Yeah.
especially as a person in recovery, like it's like I practice at this time and on this day I make this a general focus. Like I have that
Mhm.
structure, but to make it too rigid, I feel like it extinguishes my like drive, my fire to learn from these practices. And if it gets too loose, then that wildfire can get out of control. And I don't really have an off switch. That's the addictive part of me. So if there's no structure at all, it's like nobody wants to be around. Well, actually, people do want to be around that guy, but after a while, it's people get hurt. Yeah.
I think the point of like enjoying the practice is like I will take this for sure out of that. Man,
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this, like, so honestly. Even like, I mean, these phases of life are like sometimes not even like easy to share. So thank you so much. I think this is even more relatable for a lot of people and shows that even yoga teachers are just practitioners on their way. And this is great. If people would like to know more about you, the stuff you're doing, what is the best way to reach you?
Well, I have an Instagram that is Life or Death Ashtanga Yoga Club. That's a way that you can find me.
Pretty good
And I
branding.
also, yeah, that's right. And then I'm just in the process. So our old space was called the Dharma Temple that we had two. We closed just before the pandemic. And I'm creating a circle community for the Dharma Temple where I can share a philosophy and the methods that I practice. And that's something that's just in the works right now. So I can send you the URL so you can add to the show notes, but that's something that's ready to go. Because right now, like I teach in the MISA room, I teach online and in person at the same time. There's a projector on the wall and I wear a headset. So I have students from all over the world in the room, online as well as in person. And I can see the bodies on the wall because it's blown up quite big, and talk to them the same way I talk to the people in the room. And so that's been really cool. Like I have students from Mexico and from the UK and China and the United States, as well as Canada, and then in person. And the way people have connected with me for that is just through liking my content on Instagram. And it's happened relatively fast. And so now I'm working on building a space so that people can come and we can interact with each other outside of social media. So that'll be the Dharma Temple circle space that is being built as we speak. So it should be ready to go any day now.
Great. I will link it definitely below. Thank you so much and hope to hear you soon.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Marvin, and thanks for having me on your show.
Thanks. Bye. Okay. And we are out again. Guys, thank you so much for sticking around until the end. You know, this really, really means a lot to me and to all of our team who is producing the podcast. We're now 3 people working on this project. So I'm super, super glad and super happy that you're here. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for hanging around. Please don't forget to leave a good review on the podcast player of your trust and to follow the podcast along on Spotify. This really helps us out. And like always, see you next week.